Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the earth.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
The words of American astronaut Neil Armstrong from July 20th of 1969 as the fulfillment of the previous words from American President John F. Kennedy on September 12th, 1962, that would be the goal of the United States to send a manned mission to the moon successfully before the end of the decade of the 1960s. Hi, I'm Don Shelley. Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. But today we're going to explore what would have happened if July 20th, 1969 had turned out differently, if the Apollo 11 landing on the moon had not been a success. And we will spend just a brief amount of time looking at the immediate couple of days that would have been different in history. For example, we'll listen to the speech that would have been delivered by President Nixon to commemorate and recognize the status of Armstrong and Aldrin as stranded on the moon. But more importantly, we'll look at the larger ramifications of a failure of the Apollo 11 mission and what it might have meant not only for the space program, but how that might have bled over and spilled over into other parts of society and the other things that would happen in the years to come. Continuing to look at history as it actually unfolded, it's important to note that the Apollo program did not last for much longer following July of 1969, at least relatively speaking. The 1969 landing of the Apollo 11 mission was followed up by Apollo 12 in November of 1969, Apollo 13 in April of 1970, of course, that being famous for not actually being able to land on the moon because of the difficulties they had with the explosion on the way to the moon. A short respite from that for about 8 months before the Apollo 14 mission, and then as funding is cut and decisions are starting to be made by December of 1972 and Apollo 17, the last of the manned landings on the moon happened. So basically 3.5 years after the landing of Apollo 11 to Apollo 17, and the moon landing phase of the Apollo program is over. Later, Apollo hardware would be used for the joint Apollo-Soyuz mission in 1975 to demonstrate the ability to do the docking in space, and really more of a political statement than a scientific effort. But it's not very long after the moon landing that America's attention is sort of lost. In fact, if you particularly remember the movie Apollo 13, chronicling the events of the Apollo 13, where even 2 flights later, sort of the nostalgia, the air of mystery around spaceflight has begun to wane with the American public, as their science show from space is not even covered on the networks. And the American public, now that we have been successful in landing astronauts on the moon and achieving the goals of the Apollo program in the decade of the 1960s, are moving on to other things. Also, of course, is an America that's distracted by tensions over the Vietnam War, tensions over things that are building, that are pressures in the Middle East, a lot of other things that are external to just science and the pursuit of scientific endeavor. In 1973, NASA uses the Saturn V rocket system, that which had been used to propel the Apollo missions towards the moon, to put Skylab into space, and the focus on space exploration and the study of space and the effects of being in a low-gravity environment are studied closer to Earth in Earth orbit through Skylab. And of course, as we draw towards the end of the 1970s and into the 1980s, the United States transitions away from the Apollo program into the Space Shuttle program, which would change the face of American spaceflight for the next quarter century. With the growth of unmanned probes such as Voyager, actually the U.S. success with the Viking Mars missions, placing a lander there, space became commonplace, with sort of the summary statement that most people would follow and agree with being that the Soviets were the early leaders with the Sputnik launch and placing the first men into space. The United States responded, caught up, and passed them in the space race, with the landing on the moon being one of the greatest indications of that. And then, of course, the subsequent events of Voyager and the shuttle program and the Mars missions and the things that would follow. To the state that we find ourselves here in 2019 today, 50 years after the moon landing, where companies like SpaceX and others are leading the way in the private exploration and commercialization of space, discussion of space tourism, and the other things that now mean that trips to space are just a part of the norm in terms of the way that things are thought of. But as you know, A Fork in Time is not about history as it happened, but about history as it might have been. And so for our point of departure today, we are going to use July 20th, 1969, and we're going to mark as the difference in an alternative timeline what would have happened if the moon landing for Apollo 11 had been a failure. There's a couple of different ways that it might have been a failure. One possibility would have been a successful landing, but some failure of a system or some failure of a process that would have left Armstrong and Aldrin stranded on the moon without the ability to return. The other possibility would be that of an unsuccessful landing, a crash, with the likely inquiries and questions about what caused the crash and whether the potential sacrifice, both in terms of men and money, are worthwhile. To put a little flavor into and to serve as a frame of reference for the first alternative, what you're about to hear is a reading by Benedict Cumberbatch of the speech that would have been given by Richard Nixon in the event that the American astronauts Armstrong and Aldrin had been stranded on the moon and unable to return.
Fate has ordained that the men who went to the moon to explore in peace will stay on the moon to rest in peace. These brave men, Neil Armstrong and Edwin Aldrin, know that there is no hope for their recovery. But they also know that there is hope for mankind in their sacrifice. These two men are laying down their lives in mankind's most noble goal, the search for truth and understanding. They will be mourned by their families and friends. They will be mourned by the nation. They will be mourned by the people of the world. They will be mourned by a Mother Earth that dared send two of her sons into the unknown. In their exploration, they stirred the people of the world to feel as one. In their sacrifice, they bind more tightly the brotherhood of man. In ancient days, men looked at the stars and saw their heroes in the constellations. In modern times, we do much the same. But our heroes are epic men of flesh and blood. Others will follow and surely find their way home. Man's search will not be denied, but these men were the first, and they will remain the foremost in our hearts. For every human being who looks up at the moon in the nights to come will know that there is some corner of another world that is forever mankind.
Of course, Benedict Cumberbatch and Richard Nixon do not share the same vocal qualities, but try to imagine that speech being delivered by Richard Nixon to a nation and a world that is in shock and grief over the situation of knowing that there are two men who are stranded hundreds of thousands of miles away on a moon that they can see and will never return. In fact, you see it contained there in the speech, the idea that anytime anyone would ever look at the moon from that point forward, there would be the thought of the fact that there are those who were there who had given their lives, made a sacrificial effort in the furtherment of science and advancement of man, to only have failure meet them and to lose their lives and be a permanent memory there on the moon. Under this scenario, the scenario not where there's been a crash, but the scenario where there's a marooning or a stranding, it's probably more likely that NASA would be able to determine what the cause of the inability for the astronauts to return would be probably something to do with the ascent engine. So that may shorten the amount of time before the program returns to flight status. If there really is the pressure that's trying to be met to actually complete the task before the end of 1969, just a mere 6 months, it would be possible that there might be a push for Apollo 12 to go as soon as possible, as soon as the issue has been quote-unquote resolved, and there's a reasonable belief that they'll be successful in landing and then being able to return with Apollo 12. But it's also possible to imagine that there would be a lot of questions raised about pushing for this arbitrary deadline that really is not real, in the sense that it was established, gave a lot of impetus and gave a lot of momentum to the program, but there's no requirement that the task be completed before the end of 1969, before the end of the decade, to meet the Kennedy mandate. And so an interesting tension could easily have arisen between those who sort of might feel that there's a disregard for human life and safety, again, to meet some arbitrary go fever kind of deadline by rushing back to flight, where on the other hand, there may be those who are treating Armstrong and Aldrin as martyrs who have given their lives for the cause, and now it's incumbent upon the entire program and everyone else that's involved in the endeavor to complete the mission, to complete the task, and to meet the objective of doing it by the deadline that's in place. So one of the immediate short-term effects under this scenario, or any scenario, might be that where there's a tension that starts to develop in the public where there's not uniformity behind the program and behind the mission and accomplishing the mission, because what has happened has been the loss of astronauts in the process of doing so. Of course, the Apollo program had suffered loss before the Apollo 1 pad fire, but that's very different in terms of not being with all of the media hype and the media scrutiny and the public attention that would have centered around the moon landing with Apollo 11, the actual landing on the moon, the momentum that had built up to that, the anticipation that had built up to that. So one interesting potential alternate path is this sort of tension that likely would have arisen between those who wanted to push quickly forward ahead and those who would be urging caution, or maybe even urging the cancellation of the entire endeavor or postponing it and not pushing towards an artificial deadline. Would have been an interesting thing to see how it would have played out. And again, that's in the assumption and under the assumption of a scenario where the end result of a failure of the Apollo 11 mission is the result of astronauts being marooned on the moon. If instead the Apollo 11 failure is a crashing during the landing of the Eagle lander, such that it's not a question of them not being able to return, but they were not successful in landing, it's easy to imagine there an even more difficult scenario. It might have been much more difficult to determine what the cause of that crash would have been, whether there was some form of mechanical or technical failure, or whether if there was some failure by Armstrong or Aldrin, human failure, that would have led to the accident. Certainly there would definitely have been more of an investigation because there would have been less knowns, most likely under that scenario. In fact, if you're familiar with the actual landing itself, probably best portrayed in media by HBO's series from a couple of decades ago, From the Earth to the Moon, because of the difficulties that they were having with the landing radar that gave them distance and to the surface. Armstrong actually takes over and has to manually finish the landing on the moon, and does so with a very small amount of fuel left in the descent engines that are designed to bring them in for a soft landing. In fact, that famous thing of we copy you down, Eagle. A lot of folks here are about to turn blue is because the folks in Mission Control were very aware of the fact that they were very close to the marginal point of needing to abort the landing and going to firing the ascent stage, which means they would have basically aborted the landing at that particular point. In fact, the way it's often portrayed and have been discussed by space historians is that in some ways Armstrong and Aldrin went beyond the limits, perhaps, of what they should have to successfully complete the landing. So imagine that in that process something goes wrong, again, technical or perhaps human error, and the result is a crash there on the moon. And so in that scenario, an unsuccessful Apollo 11 landing probably leads to a period of at least several months or most of the rest of 1969 to try to investigate the cause of the crash. Or if they don't take the time investigating that, even more of a potential public outcry against moving forward too fast and pushing the Apollo 12 mission when there are so many unknowns about the potential failure for Apollo 11. So under the one scenario where there's a marooning situation, perhaps there's a little more flexibility, a little more willingness to take a chance. But under the crash scenario, it's easy to see that there would have been much more public pushback, concern in both inside of NASA and outside of NASA about not trying to achieve an arbitrary deadline. And eventually, again, the possibility exists that the choice may have been made to wait for maybe even a couple of years. And that's the next thing that we'll explore, is what would have happened if there had been even more of a delay between the Apollo 11 mission, a subsequent follow-up Apollo 12, and what that might have meant to the future of the program. To place the situation in the proper context, it's important to remember that the U.S. space program was not just racing against the clock in its efforts to reach the moon with manned landings, but it was also racing against the Soviet space program. In December of 1968, both programs planned to take crewed missions to the moon without the intent of landing. The U.S. program was successful with Apollo 8. However, the Soviet program, the Zond capsules that were going to carry the crew there, were not launched in December of 1968 because of some difficulties with the hardware and the technology. Once the United States had achieved the goal of a crewed mission to circumnavigate the moon ahead of the Soviet program, political interest was lost in the Soviet Union for pushing that program forward quickly. And so by July of 1969, as the Apollo 11 mission is making its way for the actual first landing on the moon after the dress rehearsal flight of Apollo 10, the Soviets have basically given up on being the first to actually complete a manned landing on the moon. So an interesting question to ponder is, if suddenly, as a result of an American accident with Apollo 11, the door had opened back up, would the Soviets have quickly rejuvenated the program that they had more or less suspended or had slowed down the progress for and moved that into a highly accelerated phase? In fact, on July 3rd of 1969, the N-1 rocket, the Soviet equivalent of the American Saturn V that would be used to propel the craft that they would use to go to the moon, had its second failure on the pad, resulting in the destruction of the rocket, but also the destruction of the launch complex. After that failure and then the subsequent American success with Apollo 11 17 days later, the Soviets did not try to resume or restart that program in the near term. If there had been an American failure with Apollo 11, would they have quickly gone to work during the period of time when there would have been a lack of flights to get another N-1 built and get it in position to be able to launch? In fact, in the initial phases of the Soviet program, the Zond program, they had planned to make their landing, if things had gone on schedule, in September of 1968. They were not on that schedule. They had fallen behind because of technical difficulties, and 2 years previous, the death of the person who was the mastermind behind the program for them. But if there had suddenly become an opportunity, a chance to leapfrog and regain the lead in the race to the moon, it's an interesting thought to ponder about whether the Soviets would have then, instead of moving resources to other types of exploration, other types of endeavors where they had a chance to be successful, whether they would have doubled down essentially on the bet with their plan and their technology, trying to take advantage of the situation and beat the Americans to the moon. It's important to remember in that situation, the Soviets had what might be considered both an advantage and a disadvantage in terms of their accountability to the Soviet people with respect to safety. They might have chosen to take a riskier return to flight with the still unproven N-1 in an effort to take advantage again of the American program being offline after an Apollo 11 failure. And they might have been willing to cut corners and take chances to achieve success, knowing that doing so would give them a political advantage and the prestige advantage that they were seeking in terms of beating the Americans. So while the American people may have been in a mode potentially of urging caution because of the recent accident and the impact from that, there would not have been a similar pressure inside of the Soviet Union if they were to have a mishap as they were trying to catch up, or in this case leapfrog, during this American blackout period as a result of an Apollo 11 failure. Continuing to trace the what-ifs. So if the Soviets had been successful in taking advantage of the American failure, and thus had beat the United States to the moon with a manned landing, then what would have been the American response? Very much as the Soviets had given up, essentially in the face of defeat, would there have been a similar situation by the United States to choose to redirect efforts and money and resources into other areas of potential success, particularly remembering that would be following the death and loss of American astronauts in the failed Apollo 11 attempt? It's sort of an interesting thing to think through here, not knowing exactly what the American public's full response would have been, to use the Apollo 11 failure as a motivating cry to move forward or as a cautionary note to put the brakes to not meet some arbitrary deadline. But it's interesting to think about essentially the seesaw action that could have happened based upon the Soviets taking advantage of the lost time by the Americans to either regain a footing in the race, making it closer, or again leapfrogging and going ahead of the Americans, and how that might have reversed the fortunes entirely. So there is the scenario with a failed Apollo 11, a resumption in the Soviet program, and Soviet success with the first manned landing on the moon, where the United States may have then simply lost interest and moved on to something else. And so at that point, it's easy to see a scenario where not only would the Apollo program have been delayed, but the Apollo program may simply have been canceled in favor of the other endeavors, which eventually did become the primary endeavors for the U.S. space program. For example, the space shuttle. Or perhaps the scenario might have been a case of, okay, the Soviets beat the Americans to the moon, but now we are going to beat them to Mars. And so the effort may have been to rechannel from Apollo into a program that would have actually been targeted with Mars as the objective versus the moon. So continuing, in this case, for the United States to double down when they had had failure at a particular moment in the space race to try to reach the next objective ahead of the Soviets. So it actually becomes possible to imagine a scenario where an Apollo 11 failure actually leads ultimately to an American success when it comes to a landing on Mars. It would be interesting to see as we look back now, decades later, whether the Apollo 11 failure would be viewed as the seed which eventually would yield victory in a redefined model of what constituted success in the space race, that being the first to land on another planet, not simply on the satellite of Earth. All of that conjecture is really just centered around the scientific components. Remember that what was going on in the United States after 1969 and for the next few years was leading up to what ultimately would be a political crisis as well as an economic crisis. The political crisis ultimately being Watergate, which came onto the scene in 72 and 73, the Arab oil embargo in 1973, and of course the item that was there all along in the backdrop, even back from the 1960s, the U.S. involvement in Vietnam. So there are several different possibilities to ponder in a scenario where the United States is either ahead or behind as a result of the Apollo 11 loss, and how that would play against the political backdrop. Would it have become even more important to an embattled Richard Nixon and a nation that felt it was under siege economically because of the oil situation and at odds with itself because of the conflict internally, politically, over its involvement in Vietnam. Would that have been a reason for the Nixon administration to push forward even more strongly with the Apollo program as a mode of finding something that was agreeable to the American people? Or would it have been the opposite? Most critics believe that the Nixon administration was not necessarily a very strong advocate for NASA. They had inherited the program to go to the moon in a situation where it certainly cannot be stopped. But if there were a good reason, Apollo 11 failure being potentially that good reason, and if that would have been followed up by the Soviets actually achieving the feat ahead of the United States, it's possible that the political pressures, the economic pressures, the other things that were going on that were being dealt with by the Nixon administration may have caused a cessation of the program, or as the shuttle program had already been envisioned in 1969 and efforts were being made towards moving towards that as being a part of the future of the United States space program, perhaps more effort would have been placed into that. So it's difficult to know exactly what the response would have been because of the political situation of Watergate, Vietnam, the oil embargo, the other things that are going on in the early to moving towards mid-70s. But there's no doubt that those political ramifications, the economic ramifications, and the budgetary ramifications, ultimately that's what caused the Apollo program to not be fully completed even after they had been successful with the Apollo 11 landing. It's easy to see a couple of different scenarios that could have played out there, and it's hard to know exactly what the real scenario would have been. I happen to personally believe that it's most likely that if the Soviets had in fact taken advantage of an Apollo 11 crash or an abandonment or some situation that would have put a negative spin on the Apollo program and slowed the program down, I think it's very likely that the United States would have changed the objective to something that it felt like it could win, and there may not have even been an effort at all by the United States to go to the moon, because there would not have been a reason to go in terms of beating the Soviets there. So it's very interesting to think through again those possibilities, and they do depend a great deal upon whether there would have been a short delay or a long delay in the resumption of flight activity after an Apollo 11 failure, and also what the Soviet response would have been. So let's look at one side of that path, the short return to flight side of the path. Under that scenario, it does not take the United States long to commit to sending what would be the next mission, Apollo 12, and as a result of that, the most likely outcome would have been that there still would have been a successful subsequent landing, and that would have been ahead of Soviet success. And so while the story that we would tell about the United States success in achieving the moon, and whether it would have been achieved in the deadline that was originally laid out by President Kennedy, still is basically the same story. You probably would have seen as a result probably most of the same history moving forward after that. In other words, if the scenario is a short return to flight followed by American success before Soviet success, there probably is not as much of a change or deviation to history that would be looked at. The history would be a little bit different. We would talk about the sacrificial role of an Armstrong and an Aldrin in terms of whoever would have ultimately been the successful U.S. astronaut who would have been the new Neil Armstrong of, let's say, Apollo 12. If the return is short, but during that period of time the Soviets are able to have success and achieve the result before the United States, then I think that is more of a difference in an outcome. Under that scenario, you have all the possibilities of the American Apollo program being substantially altered, or the focus again being changed away from winning the moon landing phase, if you will, of the space race to another phase. That might have become space station. That might have become Mars. There's a number of different things that might have become. Maybe the United States, because of losing astronauts in space, ramps up substantially the unmanned deep space probes, the Voyager type of activity, in a way that would be very different. So under that scenario, with a quick return but Soviet success, you're likely to see a very different type of outcome from that of history. Following the second broad path, which is the longer return to flight, again, the two scenarios off of that are Soviet success or Soviet failure in terms of beating the United States to the moon during the longer return scenario. First of all, it's more likely the Soviets would have reinvigorated and stepped up their efforts, and so the likelihood under a long return to flight after an Apollo 11 mishap is more likely to result in a, if you will, a Soviet victory in the race to the moon. And again, once you have that, as we just discussed previously, the change very much could be a redirection of American focus and American effort. If you had the long return to flight without a Soviet success, I think that's actually one of the most interesting scenarios sort of out of those four, in the sense of it's really hard to know what would have happened there. We still would have had the result of the U.S. winning the race to put men on the moon first, but you would have had a scenario where the path that it took to get there, the time that it took to get there, would be a very different scenario. You're also more likely now to be pushed into the other external factors that we mentioned earlier, the situation with Vietnam, the 1972 re-election, Watergate, the crisis in the Middle East leading to the Arab oil embargo. All of these things may have put additional external pressures, just removing the impetus for having an Apollo program that ran as long. So, for example, under that scenario, the U.S. wins the race, and once the race is won, decides that there's no reason to take multiple laps around the track. Or it may have been the case of very quickly moving again on to other objectives, or just deciding that once the race had been won, that a pause should just be placed on all of the activities, or much of the activities related to space. And so of all the four scenarios, sort of using those two major variables, that one's to me the hardest one to call. It's hard to know what would have happened if Apollo 12 doesn't fly until 1971 or 1972, still beats the Soviets to the mark of being able to claim being the first nation to place men on the moon. What happens then to the space shuttle program as we know it, or other types of programs that followed directly as a result of the normal path that the Apollo program took through history? I suppose one of the final questions to ask is there a scenario with a failure of the Apollo 11 landing where we would still have an unconquered moon, where the United States would have lost its resolve through technical reasons, or through a lack of political will, or not returning to the objective because of the events of Watergate and the other things that we've discussed, which would have been external factors as we move into the 70s. And the Soviets never resumed their program, or did not have success either technically. And then we find ourselves moving forward in a period of time when maybe there's not as much emphasis being placed on achieving this objective. It's interesting to note there, and one of the big questions is how much did the Kennedy 1962 speech and placing a timeline or a timetable on completing the task, how important was placing the timetable in terms of making the process move forward? So often we hear about goal setting, and one of the things that needs to be placed in goal setting is a timeliness aspect. Would there have been a different scenario with essentially the arbitrary deadline of this decade, as Kennedy had outlined it, being failed, and then because of that, maybe not as much of a resolve when the other external factors became obstacles to achieving success in terms of just not resuming the program? I think it's highly unlikely that 50 years later we would still have a moon that had not been visited by man, but I guess that is a possibility that does exist. The United States remains at this point the only nation that has carried out a successful moon landing. The fact that others have not done so might be argued as being the result of the fact that the United States has done so on behalf of mankind. but it's also possible that it may never have been within either the scientific or the political will of any other nation, excluding the Soviets, to actually undertake the effort. So while I think it's a remote possibility, one potential alternate path of history is that we would still be sitting 50 years later in 2019 without a landing on the moon. And it's hard to contemplate that. It's hard to imagine that because it's so different than the history that we've enjoyed. But at the same time, it is a possibility that's worth consideration. And certainly you can chart a course. You can outline a path where, because of the things that have already been mentioned and other factors that arose in the 70s and in the 80s that might have led to a situation where the United States would have never carried forth its mandate, and eventually the Soviet Union and a collapsed Soviet Union as a result of the end of the Cold War may not have had the resources to be able to carry forth on the program as well. And so that is a possibility that is worth considering, however unlikely, that could have resulted from a failed Apollo 11. And with that thought, we'll draw to a conclusion this particular episode of the podcast as we think about the ramifications of what would have happened if the Eagle had not landed. I hope you've enjoyed our journey down this potential alternate path in history today, and that as you're watching and observing the celebrations of the anniversary, the 50th anniversary of the July 20th, 1969 successful landing of Apollo 11 on the surface of the moon, you can imagine a scenario where things might have been different. And as a result, what we'd be commemorating either right now or in months or years to come would also be quite different as well. Again, we hope you've enjoyed the podcast today. Just as we conclude here, a reminder that we want your feedback. So please feel free to drop us an email at our email address. You'll find that in the show notes, but that address is aforkintimepodcast@gmail.com. Your reviews at the podcast location of your choice, whether you find us on iTunes or on Stitcher or on Google Play, all the various places that the podcast is posted, please feel free to leave us a review. Comments there, those are most welcome and would be helpful for us as well. In the show notes, you'll find references to all the various places we can be found on social media, places like Facebook and on Twitter. And we would certainly welcome your feedback there. Finally, if you'd like to become a more integral part of the show by becoming a patron, you can go to patreon.com/aforkintime, and there you see the opportunities to become a supporter of the show and some of the special perks that come along with that. Those include access to bonus episodes. Those also include the ability to feed into the content of the podcast through the suggestion of topics, as well as the opportunity to co-host. The podcast today has gone without a co-host, but the podcast is always better with a co-host, particularly a knowledgeable one in the particular area that we're discussing that day. So if you want to be more part of the podcast, the opportunities exist there on Patreon, and we would certainly welcome having you be a patron and supporter, even to the level of becoming essentially almost a producer for the show as well. So if that's something of interest to you, please check us out there. As always, we appreciate the fact that you found us. We appreciate the fact that you've given us the time to listen, and we know that that time is valuable, so we want to say thank you for it. So as we close things out today, I want to wish you all the best and look forward to talking to you next time. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Join us next time.